wanted to start a series of videos focusing on the weapons of World War I. Learning more about the design and operation of historic firearms is one of the rabbit holes I've gone down in my own personal interest in history. And when playing first-person shooters, you end up spending a lot of time with them. Like an old history show I used to watch years ago would say, to understand the gun is to better understand history. Let's dive into the loadout. This is the Lebel Model 1886 rifle. It was the standard issue rifle of the French Army during World War I. It is a bolt-action rifle with an 8-round capacity. Its overall length is 51.2 inches, and the barrel length is 31.5 inches. It weighs just under 10 pounds, fully loaded. Formerly designated Fusil Model 1886 Modifié 1813. This M93 was appended to the model name after modifications to the bolt and rear sight and the addition of a stacking rod in 1893. Almost all Lebel rifles were retrofitted with these changes. It became commonly known as the Lebel, named after Colonel Nicolas Lebel, one of the members of the team tasked with designing a new rifle for the French Army in 1886. His main contribution was designing the new cartridge it fired. The Lebel's design borrowed elements of older rifles used by the French, namely the Gras and Kropatschek rifles. The reason I chose the Lebel as the first in the loadout series is because it was the first firearm in history to use a smokeless powder cartridge, making it the first truly modern military rifle as we know them today. Before the invention of smokeless powder, rifles used black powder, which produced large plumes of white smoke when firing. This smoke would obscure the view of the battlefield and reveal the shooter's position to observers. Black powder, a slower burning propellant, results in slower bullet velocities and therefore shorter range. Smokeless powder cartridges produced significantly less smoke and much higher power. The Lebel fired an 8x50mm rimmed cartridge. Due to the wide taper of the cartridge, a vertical stacked magazine was not ideal. So the Lebel featured an underbarrel 8-round tube magazine. Rounds were individually loaded into the tube against a spring mechanism. The original 8mm Lebel cartridges had flat-nosed bullets to prevent striking the primer of the adjacent cartridge and detonating in the tube. By the outbreak of World War I, they had upgraded to a pointed Spitzer bullet, and a circular groove was added to the base of the casing around the primer. This groove would catch and retain the tip of the following cartridge away from the primer of the adjacent cartridge when loaded into the tube. The Lebel had an interesting bolt and loading mechanism. Closing the bolt released a cartridge from the tube magazine onto a part called the elevator. Opening the bolt all the way to the rear lifted the cartridge on the elevator into position, and closing the bolt again loaded the cartridge into the chamber and dropped the elevator to receive another cartridge from the tube. So to load the Lebel from an empty chamber, you had to fill the tube magazine, tug the bolt back to raise the elevator, then operate the bolt closed, back to the rear, and forward again to be ready to fire. I'll show a depiction of this reload in just a moment. I mentioned the Lebel had an 8-round capacity in the tube magazine. You could technically load an extra 2 rounds if you put 8 in the tube, 1 on the elevator, and 1 in the chamber. However, Lebels did not have a manual safety switch, and French military doctrine called for rifles to be carried with an empty chamber. At the risk of being reprimanded by a commanding officer, French soldiers would not have loaded the additional 2 rounds. So let's take a look at the reload and some other details as depicted in a few games. This is Battlefield 1, and here we see the French Republic soldier with the Lebel rifle. This reload animation demonstrates the operation of the Lebel. Once the final round is fired, the soldier pushes the elevator down, loads 8 rounds into the tube, and operates the bolt closed, back to the rear, and forward again to chamber a round. It is now ready to fire. For a partial reload, when you reload before the rifle is empty, the bolt is opened, which extracts the currently chambered round. The soldier fills the tube back up to 7, does a quick rearward tug on the bolt to lift the elevator, then single loads 1 onto the elevator before chambering. This single loading of the 8th round is sort of a reloading shortcut, not adding the extra rounds I mentioned before. Something else I wanted to point out is the rear sight, which you can see here. It's an adjustable ladder sight like most rifles used at the time. While this is technically not incorrect, I believe this sight would normally be flipped into the forward position to use the battle sights at normal combat distances. And the front blade sights on Lebels were pretty small, so the Battlefield developers were a little generous on this. If we take a look at the reload in the game Verdun, it's definitely more realistic in showing how slow it was to reload the tube magazine. However, it doesn't have the correct bolt operation for loading and chambering a round from the tube. But that rear sight is in the correct forward battle sight position, so bonus points to the Verdun team for that detail. Finally, in Beyond the Wire, 9 rounds are loaded into the tube for some reason, and then 1 directly in the chamber. It also doesn't use the correct bolt operation, and here the rear sight is also in the back position, just like Battlefield 1. I think they were going for the 8 plus 2 extra rounds reload, and while I appreciate the look and feel of the recoil and the sound when firing, those finer details sort of miss the mark. The Lebel used a 20.5-inch cruciform bayonet that the French affectionately referred to as Rosalie after a popular patriotic song of the time. Fun fact, the song was actually about bayonets, not a woman named Rosalie. The Germans referred to it as Stricknadel, which means knitting needle. Let's go over some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Lebel. The Lebel was regarded as a very accurate rifle. It also had a very sturdy and rugged design. It had a capacity of 8 rounds when most other contemporary rifles had 5. On the other hand, the tube magazine made reloading a very slow process. The bolt and elevator mechanism could be problematic. If you retracted the bolt without enough force, the elevator may not lift the round fully into position. Too much force and you could fling the round right out of the receiver. You can imagine this could be an issue under the stress of combat when fumbling around with your rifle. At 51.2 inches long, it could be cumbersome and clumsy maneuvering around narrow trenches. And it did not have an upper wooden handguard, which could result in burns when handling after repeated firing. If you've never fired a rifle before, the barrels get hot after just a few rounds. So what is the legacy of the Lebel 1886? Many historians say the Lebel was already outdated by the beginning of World War I, and I would agree this is partially true. The tube magazine system was an outdated feature and seems to be the biggest design flaw. However, I think some of this judgment is influenced by the benefit of hindsight because we know what was developed afterward. Yes, it had some problems, but there was nothing about the Lebel that made it vastly inferior to the other rifles fielded during the war. The Lebel began to be partially replaced during the war in small numbers by the Berthier 1907-15, which reloaded from a 3-round end-block clip. Soldiers praised the ease and speed of reloading, but complained about the limited 3 rounds. Berthiers were soon upgraded to a 5-round capacity, but I've seen conflicting information about whether the French soldiers preferred the Lebel or the Berthier. Regardless of the pros and cons, the Lebel was in service for a very long time. It remained France's primary service rifle for the duration of World War I. Although it was eventually replaced by the Berthier and eventually the MAS 36 later on, it was still in service with the French until the end of World War II in 1945. But it did not end there. The Lebel made its way to other regions of the world. During the Vietnam War, some captured Viet Cong soldiers were equipped with Lebels, a symptom of the French being in the area. And I found a US Army intelligence report from 2004 reporting Iraqi insurgent fighters with Lebels. I would wager there is a soldier, or at the very least a farmer, somewhere in Africa, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia that is carrying one right now. They are out there, somewhere. The historic significance of the Lebel is by far its most profound legacy. It set the bar in adopting the new high-velocity smokeless powder cartridges. Once the Lebel emerged on the scene, all other military rifles had to be redesigned to meet this standard. The Lebel was a revolutionary weapon, and a major stepping stone in firearms development that has secured an honored place in history. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something new. I'm Retromanzer, and I love history. I also love gaming. My goal is to share some of my love and knowledge of history, and I use games as a visual aid when I can. If there is a specific weapon you'd like to see in the Loadout series, let me know in the comments. What did you think of the Lebel? If you have another question about World War I, feel free to ask. I may not be able to cover everything, but if enough people are interested in something, I could see what I can do when planning a future video. Your question might inspire something new for us to learn. Until next time, take care and be well. Après lutter le canon fut fondant.